Hello. So it's the early hours of the morning. I was actually going to watch a film from the 1980s. I forget the name off the top of my head. Starred David Bowie, and it is about the Notting Hill race riots of 1958. Obviously, the subject of race relations has very much been on my mind of late. I think the film was made in a semi-musical sense, but it looked quite watchable. I think it got quite a few accolades, so I thought to watch that online, but the Wi-Fi is playing up, frustratingly. So this seems as topical as anything, or at least practical as anything. Um, so I want to talk about racism, and I've made a few videos about this subject, but I want to touch on a very specific aspect of it. That is particularly the fact that when it is leveled at white people in particular, that is absolutely incendiary. I mean, there's probably nothing you could say to a white person that is more incendiary than accusing them of being racist. Okay, because even if onlookers, observers, in the case of public figures, know that it's BS and know that it's a false charge, that sort of smear sticks. Now, before people misunderstand me, I am not saying that racism doesn't exist. I am not saying that there aren't white racists out there. There are. What I am saying, though, is it has become far, far too easy to charge racism against people. It's one of my main critiques of Black Lives Matter is that they, BLM activists, are just throwing racism left, right, and centre. Anything that goes wrong is racism. And watch what's going to happen here. In fact, we've already seen it. The police are deliberately stepping back from situations. Sometimes it's supposedly for logistical reasons. Recently, for example, a rave they didn't intervene in a rave in Manchester. Now that's going to be mixed. So I'm not saying that's a Black Lives Matter event, but they stepped back because they said the numbers would have aggravated the situation. Possible, looking at the police perspective, that might be true, but that's a sorry state of affairs if the police aren't imposing law and order because they're worried it would escalate things so people who are breaking the law can do so with impunity. But regarding Black Lives Matter, um, I think the police are sort of stepping back somewhat because now we're going to have a situation where every time a black person is arrested, someone is going to film a little segment of it and then say it's brutality when maybe there's no brutality involved. And they won't record the part where the black suspect is maybe rioting just before that, like throwing missiles at the police. Um, so this is a big problem because people are going to look at little segments of things and assume it proves something when it really, really doesn't. I believe that where there is strong evidence of police brutality, as in the George Floyd case, that needs to be, of course, taken very seriously. But it's like we could call it the George Floyd effect. Every time a black suspect is apprehended now, they're going to use that as an excuse, and so is Black Lives Matter. They're going to say, oh, it must be racism, it must be brutality, which basically means black criminals will get away with it in a way that white criminals wouldn't. Because a white police officer arresting a white criminal is obviously not going to have the same sort of emotional impact. Um, but I absolutely despise some of the race baiting that is going on right now. I think it is toxic. I think it is dishonest, and I think it's helping no one. It's not helping black and minority people because it's it's putting out this narrative. Any problems you have in life, fault of the white establishment, the white majority. I mean, this really is a recipe for trouble. Um, but I think we really need to challenge this idea. I mean, we as a society, that someone could be accused of racism so flippantly, so casually, and they can deny it, and they might get defended by some people, but that damage is absolutely, you know, it's incendiary. And the people who are doing the accusations, making the accusations, there's not really much accountability to back it up. Not to say that there isn't. I am not saying that every time the charge of racism is made, it's not there. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that all it takes is for a black or brown person to say that a white person is a racist, and then their whole reputation could be destroyed. It's similar to when you get false accusers in rape cases, destroying a man's life. That doesn't mean that rape isn't a real issue. It doesn't mean that women shouldn't be believed. But I agree with the principle of looking at each case on its own merits. So, and I don't want to digress too much here, but the notion of believe all women is a very reckless way to look at it, because then it insinuates that all women are telling the truth and all men are liars in terms of rape cases. The fair way to look at it would be to look at each situation individually, look at the facts, look at the evidence, look at all this information is available, and certainly sympathize with women making allegations. But I don't believe in just believing them outright. I think they should be sympathized with, treated in with the assumption that they have been through that ordeal, but not just an assumption that the man must be guilty. In a way, the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement have both done this. Me Too has sent out this insinuation that all men must be guilty, and Black Lives Matter has sent out the insinuation that all white people are not racist but part of white privilege, which is a term I despise. Um, I mean, there's nothing more racist than judging an entire group of people by the color of their skin. It's that simple. And I really feel depressed that race baiters get so much of a platform. You know, um, these black celebrities that have actually done well for themselves, whether it be through music or sport or another endeavor, and then um, they have the audacity to play the race card, even though they've done well in life themselves. I think that's really a problem. And no, it's not about, oh, they should just be grateful. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying maybe they should put things in context. Maybe they should consider that, okay, they've worked hard at what they've done and they've got far. So why can't that be the case for other black people? I mean, Anthony Joshua made a speech to the Black Lives Matter protest. He did touch on gang issues, but he was also doing a fair bit of race baiting. And I've read in Boxing Magazine one person wrote a very thoughtful piece. It wasn't just a rant; it was a very thoughtful piece about how Joshua will have polarized a lot of white fans with that segregationist speech. And unfortunately, if the Joshua Fury fight goes ahead next year, it would be the biggest domestic British clash ever. If this thing continues, if these, Black Lives Matter protests continue, then we could see a situation where that fight becomes racialized, and it really, really shouldn't. Tyson Fury's already said he doesn't, it's not a racial issue, but people are going to, because of the rhetoric that we're seeing, because of the sectarianism, people are going to be pushed into one camp or the other, like white fans for Fury and black fans for Joshua. It shouldn't be that way. That's something that belongs in the past. That certainly was true right up until the 1980s, but I would say boxing's come a long way in terms of race. Not perfect, but it has improved. Um, and when Joshua, made the sort of segregationist speech that he did, now apparently he's claiming that he was just reading off a speech that was written for him. Well, if I was a public figure as famous as he is, I would check the details before just reading it. And I don't believe that. I saw his speech. It looked like it was very much personal, and he was really, you know, saying what he believed. And I do think that some of that speech was valid, but other bits were sheer race baiting, which is what Black Lives Matter is all about. This doesn't mean that I think every single Black Lives Matter activist hates white people. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But, not every third wave feminist hates men, but the movement is still pretty anti male. And the way that the media and much of the political establishment has pandered to this movement is very concerning because it sort of indicates the sort of power that they have to distort and to manipulate the power system. Okay, this is not standing up to power. This is actually manipulating power. Um, I mean, if you look at the sort of way, and this goes beyond Black Lives Matter. I mean, if you look at the way CNN, to some extent the BBC, the Guardian newspaper, the Independent newspaper, the Eye, and let's say Huffington Post, those are some examples off the top of my head. The way they deal with race relations is always, always, always through the prism of privileged white people versus downtrodden black and brown people. This is insulting to black and brown people because it insinuates that they're children who need to be kind of helped up, and every problem they face must be the fault of the privileged white. It's sheer, it's the most toxic, divisive, nasty, and dishonest narrative. Because when you actually look at the facts, I mean, take white privilege, for example, that concept totally ignores white poverty. It totally ignores the fact that white people also get rejected for job interviews. It totally ignores white homelessness. You know, I always make the point the area where I live, right, northeast England, 100 years ago, if you were a young white man in this region, in fact, not just 100 years ago, I'll use this as an example. 100 years ago, you were a young white man in Sunderland or County Durham. What was your choice in life? You would be sent to the shipyard. You would be sent down a coal mine. This was dark, dangerous work, grueling, long hours. Or at the time of the First World War, you would be sent to the Western Front, where there's a very strong chance you will be blown to smithereens by machine gun fire, or blown apart by a mine or a shell. That's the reality. And that reality went into fairly recent times without the war aspect. If you were a young man growing up in the 1970s in the northeast of England, again, in many cases, it was go down the pit. Look at Billy Elliot, look at films like that that really show that sort of life. So the idea of white privilege couldn't be further from the truth for those sort of situations. And there's other examples as well. The word slave comes from Slav, comes from the Slavic people. I assume it's etymology. I haven't studied this in depth, but I assume that comes from the fact the Romans kept slaves of so-called barbarian tribes. But slavery's been something apparent throughout human history. Yet, for some reason, Black Lives Matter only focuses on the Arab, only focuses on the transatlantic slave trade. For some reason, they seem strangely um, passive about the Arab slave trade, which enslaved countless, countless numbers of black victims. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I am not saying that there aren't real issues faced by the black and minority community. And I'm even reluctant to use that term because it's kind of divisive in its own right. But I'm not saying that. For example, there has been a disproportionate number of deaths from BA, people from COVID. So the reasons for that need to be understood. Lifestyle may be part of it. It may be access to medical services. Um, but I do not believe that you could credibly claim, oh, well, more black people are dying because of racism. I mean, that doesn't make sense when you consider that a lot of those who've died are actually themselves nurses and doctors. Um, so the idea that it's racist somehow that black and minority people aren't getting treatment, it could be because they are not coming forward if they've got the symptoms. It could be, I don't know what the reasons are, but I think it's far too simplistic to just say, oh, it's because of racism. And that's also an insult to, white people who've died and whose families are grieving. Um, but what I would like to see change, race baiters won't change. They will continue throwing out the narrative of everything is racist, and they'll continue finding the little microaggressions and other totalitarian sort of thought control, which is just, it's worse than pathetic. It's actually, it is totalitarian. When you try policing how people speak, when you try punishing people for supposed microaggressions. So, if someone says, "Where are you from?" and you perceive that to be a microaggression, and then you think you have a green light to smear that person as a racist, that's the sort of thing I want to see challenged. I'm not talking about actual racists. Okay, so I've no interest in defending white supremacists because actually they're race baiters themselves. I mean, when I'm attacking race baiting, I'm attacking across the board. I say the same thing for white race baiters, such as those who talk about so-called white genocide. Now that's race baiting of the worst kind. And certainly in the United States, you can see perceptions of double standards. I mentioned that case in New York City recently, where the white woman was really kicking up a tantrum because the black guy asked her to put her dog on a leash. Now, people will look at cases like that and say that's white privilege. I would say more that's just that particular woman being an entitled brat. I don't think it's evidence that all white people are privileged. Um, it just shows that some people have a chip on their shoulder, or some people rather have an entitled mindset. But I have to say, I agree with Lawrence Fox. You know, black and minority actors who've done very well for themselves, and yet complain about how racist Britain is. I take a very dim view of that because their living experience proves otherwise. They are literally people who have been successful in their field. They have huge salaries that most of us can never dream of, and yet they're complaining. So I think that just raises the question: what are they actually doing for society in that sense? If all they are doing is portraying the picture that it's all racist, even though they themselves have done well in this supposedly racist hellhole. So there is an enormous amount of dishonesty. But what I'd really like to see is more of a onus on race baiters, more of an onus on people who throw the term racism around left, right, and centre to prove it. If I call someone a racist, I'll be damn sure that I've got backing for it, that I've got evidence for it, you know? And whilst racism as a charge might be damaging to anyone it's thrown at, I honestly believe that if you accuse a black or Asian person of racism, it's not good in terms of reputation, but it's far less damaging because this is something uniquely incendiary to white people. So, for example, you get a black MP and he or she makes a generalization about all white people. It will anger a lot of white people, but they'll keep the job. They won't have to make an apology. They might make some excuse, but they will keep the job. You get a white MP that says something similar, there will be demands for their resignation. There's clearly double standards at work here. I mean, one could look at that in the recent London violence, where the police were very proactive when it came to the far right demonstrations, and that's fine. I have no sympathy for that lot. I think the Prime Minister was right. They're a bunch of buffer boys. They were just there to get boozed up and cause trouble. Fine. But when it came to the Black Lives Matter rioters, the faction of them who were rioting, then it was constantly dismissed as a few troublemakers and, mostly peaceful. But that violence wasn't a little side thing. It was quite significant. A large number of officers were injured, and it wasn't just some little side event, as has been portrayed. There was footage, for example, of BBC journalists being chased down a tunnel by black thugs. So let's not dismiss that. Then the Metropolitan Police issued CCTV footage of rioters, and based on those pictures, it was fairly mixed, actually. I would say, in fact, the pictures they had, about a third of them were white and the other two-thirds were black. So these were from all the unrest, and presumably they were trying to find these people. But the police themselves, while some sympathetic to the pressures they face, sometimes they do themselves no favors. I mean, that whole taking a knee gesture, I think it was really problematic because it sent out a message of, we're supporting your narrative. I mean, it's one thing having a dialogue. I think that's important. I think it's important the police listen to anger. I think it's important the police show that they're not above criticism or accountability. It's quite another actively subjugating themselves to a particular movement, which is basically what taking the knee was. I mean, look at the backlash Dominic Raab has faced for this. For what? For saying that he only bowed to the Queen and his missus. He may have misplaced the connotations by saying it came from Game of Thrones when it came from the Colin Kaepernick gesture, but the backlash that Raab received, from the woke left, that's, how dare he not take the knee? It's insane. Why should he take the knee? Why should anyone take the knee? Um, so there seems to be this unique expectation of white people to be anti-racist, yet there's no such expectation on black people to speak out against black racists or Asian racists. Of course, there is those who say, "Oh, it doesn't even exist. Black people can't be racist." Yes, they can, and more often than not, they are, or rather, the black racists are. But as a white guy, I do not believe I'm a victim. I do not believe there's an agenda against white people. So I'm not tapping into conspiracy theories here. I do, however, believe there's double standards. And I do think that there is far, far too little scrutiny of those who push this. I mean, if you look at the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests from the BBC, when the reporter, who herself is mixed race, when she gets into these protests, the footage I've seen, she never says, "What would you say to people who say the movement is X, Y, and Z?" She just panders to their narrative. That's generally the coverage. CNN's the same. CNN will never ever ask Black Lives Matter activists tough questions. They'll never say, for example, "Well, what about the fact that this weekend in Chicago there has been 63 shootings? 63 shootings, and I believe it's 9 deaths. And that's going to be overwhelmingly black on black. So why does CNN ignore that?" I do think the media has a lot to answer for in terms of how it reports these things, or particularly the organisations I mentioned. I think they're adding fuel to the fire and then they play innocent. It's pretty, when you think about it, pretty disgraceful. It's pretty repugnant that they're not doing their job properly, that they're not asking everyone tough questions. They can report Black Lives Matter are concerned about this, they're angry about the police violence. What you see from the likes of Don Lemon and others on CNN, they're actively promoting the movement. They're actively encouraging the movement. They're actively towing the narrative of the movement. They're not doing their job as journalists by asking everyone challenging questions. And, they're powerful. So that's pretty shameful, in my opinion, when journalists will not do their job. I'm training as a freelance journalist right now, and if I was covering some protest or rally, I would try my best to get as many opinions as I possibly could from both sides. Of course, I'm going to have my opinions. Of course, I'll have ideological thoughts, but I think that journalists really need to at least try, not be absolutely neutral, but at least give a semblance that they're doing the job properly by asking people difficult questions, not by just going along with the narrative. Okay, I'll round it up. Thanks for watching.